Welcome to a new episode of our Past Imperfect podcast. Today, we're going deep into the world of British politics with Simon Hart's memoir, Ungovernable, The Political Diaries of a Chief Whip. Hart used Chief Whip under Rishi Sunak, and his book, it covers this crazy period from 2019 to 2024. I mean, talk about a roller coaster. Brexit, a global pandemic, a whole bunch of different prime ministers. It's like all in just a few years, you know?
Yeah, it really is. It might seem like ancient history already to some people, but
Yeah.
it's important we need to understand this time because we're still kind of feeling the effects today, right? And what's really interesting about Hart's perspective is the contrast. He starts in 2019 and the Conservatives, they just won this huge majority. They were optimistic, feeling powerful, like they had a real mandate to change the country.
Yeah.
But that control, it just vanished so quickly.
Yeah, he really shows how fast things can change in politics. Like, 1 minute you're on top of the world, the next you're in total crisis mode. And speaking of crisis mode, let's talk about Brexit. The book's pretty upfront about how Brexit just split the Conservative Party right down the middle.
Absolutely. It wasn't just politics, you know. Brexit was like this fundamental ideological divide. It went right through the heart of the party. Hart talks about how he was always constantly having to manage these MPs, and they had completely opposite views on everything. Like, how should Brexit even happen? How close should the UK stay to the EU? Some even questioned if Brexit was a good idea in the first place.
It sounds like a total nightmare. Can you give us an example from the book, like something that shows the kind of dilemmas Hart had to face?
Okay, well, there's this part where he's talking about the withdrawal agreement. You know, that was the deal setting the terms for the UK leaving the EU. So he had these hardline Brexiteers. They wanted a clean break. It didn't matter what it cost the economy. But then there were these more moderate MPs. They were really worried about damage to trade, the economy. And Hart was stuck in the middle, trying to find some kind of compromise so the party wouldn't just completely rebel, like weighing the political risks against, you know, the economy falling apart. No easy answers there.
So he's dealing with this Brexit pressure cooker. And then, on top of it all, a global pandemic hits. I can't even imagine a worse time to be in charge of keeping a party in line.
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic, it was a political crisis on top of a health crisis. Suddenly, the government's making these huge life or death decisions. They have to implement lockdowns, face all the scrutiny over how they're handling things. And all those disagreements that were simmering because of Brexit, they just exploded under the pressure of the pandemic. The stakes were so high, and there was almost no room for error.
And of course, it wasn't just those two things. You had all these scandals happening at the same time, rocking the government. Hart mentions a bunch of big names. Nadine Dorries, Matt Hancock, Lee Anderson. And their exits, their suspensions, none of it was quiet.
No, not at all. And it wasn't just isolated incidents. These scandals, they eroded public trust, made the government look even more unstable. It was like this feeling that everything was spinning out of control.
You know, it's interesting. These scandals, they seem to fall into different categories. There were financial scandals, scandals about personal behavior, and then the ones that were more about, like, political maneuvering and breaking trust. Did Hart talk about these different types of scandals and how they impacted things differently?
Yeah, he definitely acknowledges that some were more explosive than others. For example, those allegations about the lockdown parties at 10 Downing Street. You know, while the rest of the country was under strict restrictions, that was a huge blow to their credibility, made them look totally hypocritical. Hart talks about the public outrage, the turmoil it caused inside the party. That was a real turning point.
Okay, so turning point. And let's talk about the chief whip. For people who maybe aren't familiar with British politics, could you explain what that role actually is?
Sure. So the chief whip, they're basically responsible for party discipline. They're like the enforcer, making sure that MPs vote the way the party leadership wants. It's a tough job, especially when you have a party as divided as the Conservatives were back then.
Okay, so imagine you're Simon Hart. You're the chief whip, and you've got all these rebellious MPs just openly defying the party. What do you do? What kind of tools do you have to handle that?
Well, Hart's book is pretty open about the methods they used. It was a mix of rewards and punishments, offering things like good committee assignments, hinting at future ministerial roles, but also making it very clear that there would be consequences for those who didn't toe the line. He had to be this master negotiator, constantly trying to keep different factions happy.
But was it always ethical? I mean, did Hart ever express any regret for the things he had to do?
That's a really good question. He does say that the job forces you to make tough choices, to play hardball sometimes. He admits he had to apply pressure, make promises, sometimes even resort to threats. Whether you see those tactics as ethical, that's up for debate.
It definitely sounds like a job that would take its toll. And on top of everything else, Hart had to work under three very different prime ministers. You had Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and then Rishi Sunak. How did those changes in leadership impact the party's stability and their ability to actually govern?
Each transition brought its own set of challenges, you know. Johnson, he was charismatic, but also prone to making mistakes, getting into scandals. Truss, her time was very brief, chaotic, a lot of economic instability. And then Sunak came in, trying to bring back some order, some credibility. Hart had to adjust his approach for each leader, managing their expectations, trying to keep the party looking somewhat united, despite all the upheaval.
I'm curious, did Hart's book get into the specific policy differences between Johnson, Truss, and Sunak, and how he, as chief whip, had to navigate those?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the best things about the book is how it shows how personality and policy were all tangled up together. Like, he talks about how Johnson's boosterism that really clashed with Sunak's more cautious style, especially when it came to economic policy. Hart was often stuck in the middle, trying to reconcile these different views, prevent them from becoming open conflict.
It sounds like an incredibly demanding job, and sometimes probably a thankless one. And yet, Hart stayed in that role for several years. What does that tell us about him as a political operator?
I think it shows that he was a master tactician. He could read people, anticipate problems, build alliances. He clearly understood how power worked within the Conservative Party. And he had a knack for navigating those internal politics. Whether you agree with his methods or not, he was definitely effective. It was a role that needed resilience, cunning, and a high tolerance for chaos.
Well, and that's just the start. We've only scratched the surface of Simon Hart's story, this fascinating account of this crazy time in British politics.
Yeah.
Join us for part 2. We'll go even deeper into the scandals, the leadership battles, and the personal toll of being right in the middle of the political storm.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Simon Hart's Ungovernable. Last time we talked about all the stuff Hart had to deal with as chief whip, Brexit, the pandemic, those scandals. But what I found really interesting was how he showed the human side of it all. You know, the personal cost of being in politics.
Yeah, he's not afraid to share those personal stories. Like there's this one part he talks about trying to have a family dinner, but at the same time, he's getting all these calls from MPs, freaking out, threatening to rebel. Shows you just how much pressure he was under and how his work life and personal life were just constantly blurred.
Right. It reminds you that politicians aren't just these, figures making decisions. They're people, they have families, their own struggles, doubts. And Hart's book, it gives us a peek into that world that we don't usually see.
It makes you wonder, like, what kind of person can handle that? What do you need to not just survive, but actually thrive as a chief whip?
Well, based on what Hart says, it seems like you need a very specific set of skills. You need to be good at diplomacy, negotiation, obviously. You have to be able to read people, understand what makes them tick, and find ways to get everyone on the same page. But maybe most importantly, you need resilience. You're dealing with conflict, pressure, unexpected problems all the time. It's definitely not a job for the weak.
Yeah, resilience is a good word. He always seemed to be able to bounce back from setbacks, keep things from completely falling apart. But it also makes you think about the long-term effects of a job like that. Did he ever talk about how it affected him personally, his relationships, his well-being?
There are definitely parts in the book where you see the fatigue, the frustration, even a little bit of disillusionment. He mentions the long hours, the travel, all the family things he missed. And he hints at the weight of responsibility, knowing that his decisions had real consequences for people.
So we've been focusing a lot on the personal side. But I think we should also talk about the bigger implications of what Hart's telling us. This deep dive has been great for understanding how British politics worked during this time. But for someone who's not, obsessed with politics, why should they care about all this behind-the-scenes drama?
That's a really good point. I think there are a few key things here that everyone can relate to. First, it shows that even in democracies that seem stable, things can change incredibly fast. I mean, the Conservative Party went from this landslide win to almost collapsing in just a few years. And a lot of that was because of the things we've been talking about.
Right. It shows that power is never absolute.
And these events, pandemics, scandals, divisive issues like Brexit, they can completely change the political landscape. Absolutely. Yeah. And the second thing is, it shows how important individual people are, even within these big systems. It's easy to think of politics as this kind of abstract thing, but Hart's book shows us that decisions made by individuals, how they use their power, the compromises they make, all of that has a real impact on everyone.
It's like even people working behind the scenes, like the chief whip, can have a huge influence on what happens.
Exactly. And the last thing I'd say is, this deep dive is a good lesson in critical thinking. When we read the news or listen to political commentary, it's easy to just accept what we're told. But Hart's book encourages us to look deeper, question things, consider all the different sides of an issue.
It's like there's always more to the story than what we see on the surface. And to really form an opinion, we need to look at things from different perspectives, even ones we might not agree with.
Absolutely. And that's something we should all try to do, whether it's about politics, current events, or anything else that's complicated. Being able to think critically, question what we hear, and find different viewpoints, that's so important for being informed citizens.
All right, so Hart's memoir, it gives us this really honest, unfiltered view of a chaotic time in British politics. It reminds us that power can be attractive, but also dangerous. And the people who have it are often stuck between these competing demands and having to make really tough decisions.
Yeah, and what struck me was how he was able to show both the big historical picture and also these small human moments that happen in politics. It's a story about ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and ultimately it's about trying to navigate a system that can be unpredictable and unforgiving.
Now, for people who might not be super familiar with British politics, one thing Hart talked about was pairing agreements. Can you explain what those are and why they were important in this whole situation?
Sure. So a pairing agreement is basically an agreement between two MPs. They're from opposing parties, and they agree not to vote on a specific issue. They usually do this when one MP can't be in Parliament, maybe because they're sick, traveling, or busy with something else. It makes sure that the overall vote isn't affected by one person being absent.
But Hart's saying that pairing agreements became more than just about that, right? They became a strategic tool.
Exactly. The Conservatives had this small majority, and they were really divided. So every vote was super important. Hart talks about how he used pairing agreements to not just deal with absences, but also to neutralize people in his own party who might rebel. He would pair a Conservative MP who was going to vote against the government with an MP from the opposition. So basically, their votes would cancel each other out, and that would make sure the government's plans wouldn't get derailed.
It sounds pretty clever, but also a bit controversial. It makes you wonder about how transparent this system is, and if these backroom deals are undermining how Parliament is supposed to work.
Yeah, definitely. There were a lot of people who criticized it at the time. They said it was a way for the government to manipulate things and silence people who disagreed with them. But the people who supported it, including Hart, they said it was necessary to keep things stable and to stop the government from being completely paralyzed by all the disagreements.
It's a really interesting example of how they use the rules of the game, and sometimes bend them, to get what they want politically.
And it goes back to that idea of power dynamics that's all over Hart's book. He gives us this really open look at how influence works, the strategies they use, and the compromises they make, all to achieve their political goals.
It reminds you that politics is rarely straightforward. There are a lot of gray areas where it's hard to tell what's right and wrong.
Yeah, and the people in power often have to face these ethical dilemmas. And it's a world that, even though it's complicated and messy, has a big impact on all our lives. Understanding how it works, who the players are, and what motivates them. That's crucial for dealing with the challenges we face as a society.
So Hart's book is a really valuable piece of the puzzle. He doesn't shy away from the ugly side of politics, the deals, the power struggles, the personal sacrifices. He pulls back the curtain and shows us the human drama that's happening behind all the headlines and sound bites.
And maybe the most important thing is he makes us think critically about the systems that control our lives, to have real discussions, and to hold the people in power accountable.
Welcome back to Cast Imperfect. We've been really digging into Simon Hart's Ungovernable. This incredible behind-the-scenes look at British politics from 2019 to 2024. It's been quite a journey. Brexit battles, pandemic chaos, more scandals than you can count.
Yeah, and it's not just what happened, it's how he tells it. Hart captures those big historical moments, but also those small human moments, those decisions, the compromises, even the times when things were just kind of ridiculous.
Speaking of ridiculous, there's that story about the pigeon, remember? This really tense meeting, MPs arguing about Brexit legislation, and then bam, a pigeon flies into the room.
Yeah, total chaos, like everything stops.
Because even in these super serious situations, life just throws these curveballs.
Right. Politics, for all the formality, it's still about people.
And people are, well, capable of amazing things, but also sometimes just plain silly.
Exactly.
And those moments, they make Hart's book so interesting. He's not pretending to be this perfect political genius. He's honest about his mistakes, his frustrations, those times when he felt overwhelmed by everything.
That honesty is really valuable. It's easy to look at politics from the outside and think, oh, they're all just playing games. But Hart's book, it shows you the human side of it. The toll it takes, the tough choices, the real consequences.
Yeah, it reminds you there's more to the story than the headlines. Hart shows us the deals, the compromises, all the stuff happening behind closed doors. And you realize politics isn't always clear-cut. It's a lot of gray areas where right and wrong get a little blurry.
It makes you think about perspective, too. This is just Hart's side of the story, right? His experiences, his beliefs, his role in the party.
So we have to remember that. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. We need to look for other perspectives, other stories to get the full picture.
That's what's so great about history.
It's this ongoing conversation. We keep reinterpreting the past, questioning things, finding new evidence.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Ungovernable, what stood out to you the most? What's the one thing you think our listeners should take away from this?
I think for me, it's how important compromise is in politics. Hart talks about how, as chief whip, he was always trying to find common ground, trying to bring people together, make the system work, even when it felt like everything was falling apart.
Yeah.
And that's a good lesson for everyone, I think, not just in politics, but in life. Even when things are really divided, there's still space for talking, for understanding, for finding solutions that work for everyone.
It's like even in the most polarized situations, we can still talk to each other, find common ground, work together.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in that us versus them mentality. But to actually solve problems, make progress, we have to be willing to listen to people who think differently, find what we agree on, and work together.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to end this. Simon Hart's Ungovernable. It's a fascinating book, really insightful. It gives us a look into British politics during a really crazy time. It reminds us that power is complicated, messy, and the people who have it are under a lot of pressure.
But it also shows the human side of it. The people who work in public service, who deal with these complex problems, and who try to make a difference, even when it's hard.
It's been great talking about this with you, and we hope our listeners enjoyed this deep dive. If you've read Ungovernable, let us know what you thought. And if you want to learn more about this period in British politics, there are lots of other resources out there. You can read accounts from other people involved or analysis from experts.
Yeah, remember, history is a conversation that never ends. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more voices to hear.
Thanks for listening to Past Imperfect. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating historical topic. Don't forget to send in your comments.